Good evening and welcome to the Dryden Theatre. I'm Phil Taylor, Associate Curator in the Department of Photography here at the George Eastman Museum. It's my great pleasure to welcome artist Liz Deschenes back to the Dryden. And by back, I mean just because the Dryden's also been a part of our conversations as Liz and I have developed this conversation, this collaboration and exhibition over several years now. It's been not a direct site of engagement, but as we've thought about the relationships between photography and film, somehow it's been another sort of context that has always been in play. So welcome back, Liz. When I began working at the museum 3 years ago, I developed sort of a short list, a bucket list of goals and artists who I really wanted to work with. And Liz was truly at the top of that list. So it's really a great honor to have this exhibition on view at the George Eastman Museum. And I would like to briefly, before we launch into our conversation this evening, thank a few of the many people who have truly made this goal be one that has been realized. First and foremost, this exhibition and this program were generously made possible by Deborah Renan. Thank you, Deborah. Your support of contemporary art here in Rochester is essential in so many ways, and we are so grateful for your leadership in this regard. I'm also grateful to the generous support of John Benis and Elaine Goldman. And this presentation is part of a slate of programs in honor of the Eastman Museum's 75th anniversary. And that slate has had major support provided by the Rubens Family Foundation. So we are grateful to all of those sponsors for making the incredible work we do here at the museum possible. For their tremendous work in putting together tonight's event, I also want to thank Emma Rathie, Eliza Kozlowski, Sherry Smith, and the Dryden team, as well as my colleague Jamie Allen in the Department of Photography. Liz Deschenes' accomplishments are legion. She's been the recipient of awards including Anonymous Was a Woman and the Trellis Art Foundation's grants. She's had solo exhibitions at august museums in Europe and around the United States, and her works are in the collections of many of the most significant museums of contemporary and modern art. With that, I'll say, before we launch into this conversation, in the 20 years that I have seriously studied the history of photography and contemporary art, photography has undergone several distinct moments of critical evaluation or re-evaluation and reassessment, often moments of critical anxiety. And as I've sort of lived through those moments, Liz's work is one set of practices that I've returned to repeatedly, because I think it's really a practice and a set of works that compels us to think about the contours of the medium, the operations and forces that course through the photographic. And there are works that forcefully ask us to look differently at the objects themselves. With that, please join me in welcoming Liz Deschenes to the stage. Testing, there we go.
Thank you.
Voila. Just before we launch into this, I want to explain, this is going to be an organic conversation, and I'm thrilled to see so many artists and friends of the museum here this evening. Rather than something that's rigorously structured, the slides that are on display behind us are going to cycle through, and they move roughly chronologically across Liz's career so that you all can have a sort of orientation to some of the types of work that we're talking about. And sprinkled in there are some slides of works that are in the Eastman collection, some of which are in view in the collection exhibition Life with Photographs, 75 Years of the Eastman Museum, and others of which play a sort of important role in Liz's dialogue with the museum, much like this one. I'll say, by way of introduction, Liz, that your exhibition, Frames Per Second Silent, really is grounded in the intersections of photography and film. And the Eastman Museum's three major collecting areas are, of course, photography, film, and also technology and technological apparatuses. And so in thinking about ways that we could honor the museum's 75th anniversary, that was yet another reason that your practice seemed like a natural place for an intervention of sorts. So maybe to start things off, if you could reflect a little bit, thinking in terms of the works that are in the exhibition, but these key themes that run through your work over the past 25 years include this repeated investigation of color, but also the use of the photogram as a sort of device for thinking about a variety of conceptual problems. And I wonder if you might reflect on how those things are operative in this exhibition.
Upon visiting, not sure if it stayed on. Upon visiting a few years ago, or revisiting, because I had come to see some of the dye transfer prints owned by Eastman over 20 years ago, it became apparent to me that the way the apparatuses are on view in the museum has a semi-fixed feeling to it. I was just talking with some of the curators about how obviously photography, because of conservation and fugitivity, obviously has to be rotated, but it seems as though the apparatus on view don't need to be rotated and have a presence of the operator, even though the operator is no longer present. So that was part of what I began thinking about. And, in all honesty, it's a really complicated set of spaces. Because anytime there's you've all visited the peristyle space, it could be a space where people don't pay attention. So the desire to get people to pay attention to something they might just wander through was, another motivation. And you graciously hosted, numerous visits. So I got to think about what happened to film, where technologies before sound was added. I'm not a filmmaker. I have, close people in my life who are and have studied it. And they'll all argue that film was infinitely more interesting before audio was added. These are some of the things I wanted to investigate, through works and through a nod to what was semi-permanently on view.
And so
can do this.
This one. Yeah. Thank you, Emma. Just to underscore, one of the central concerns on a sort of historical referential level in the exhibition is the way in which time is governed through cinema. So the title Frames Per Second refers to the regulation of the number of images that are projected in film per second in a given circumstance. And that's something that, to your point, was not always fixed. It's something that only became standardized in the 1920s. But for the first decades of film, there was not the same standardization, and how a film was both recorded and then projected was dependent on the performance of an operator. And there might sometimes be notes that were given as a film was distributed about the different pacing, and that pacing may even have changed within a given performance as directed, but there was also always this operator and this hand that was present there. And so it seems like that was the thing that you really grasped onto in terms of thinking about the silent film era.
I mean, some of, your curators, conservationists, professionals in the museum taught me that operators would sing in order to hold a rhythm while projecting. And I find it really interesting that you could shoot X amount of frames and then project at a completely different speed. That's obviously a mutable, aspect of pre-sound film. These obviously are, about the hand as well, because they're made, utterly by hand, not machined, even though many people feel like they look machined, but as you look closer, you see the hand, even in the images that are really well done, you can see the hand of making them.
Yeah, and I think with the frame per seconds works that we're talking about here that just rolled by on the screen, which are photograms, they're camera-less photographic works that, Liz, you've made. They have this sort of inherent tension between them, between the sense that they are extremely refined in their edges, their milling. They have a certain degree of feeling like industrial products, but then, as you're saying, if you look closer, then there are all these other complex things that are happening there. And in some cases, it seems like one might even be seeing fingerprints or something else. And because of how then you have produced this as a serial object composed of multiple units, some of those elements seem to recur across them.
Yeah, sure.
Versus there is a particularity of incident
Sure.
Within that as well.
Well, the history of making them gets embedded in the surface of the work. So obviously you see the hand, but you also see, if you're working with mural-sized paper, it doesn't have to roll back on itself, but I chose that it would roll back on itself. So those creases that you see are from the paper themselves.
And then in some cases, particularly with the elements, I should say, the title FPS 12, 16, 18 refers to 3 different film rates, which would have been operative in the silent film era. Some of those are more common, and at least one is a bit of an outlier.
The 12, I think you only
Yeah.
found one film that was actually shot and projected at 12, right?
Right.
Yeah.
But there is that sense that it was certainly within the realm of possibility, and part of what is interesting about this project and intervention into film and photographic history, I think, is the possibilities for other modes of performance, of other modes of interpretation that might arise through that. And within this installation, you've integrated elements which represent these 3 different frame rates. Each of the 3 bays represents a discrete second of cinematic time, but within that second, there's variability. So as one walks along it, one might essentially be experiencing a allegorical representation of a changing filmic duration. And within that, then the narrower strips of photograms, there's this incredible amber color that emerges in places. And I think that's, again, one of these moments where color's eruption in this project does something really surprising and striking. And then I'm intrigued by how that's related to other aspects of your work, where you're breaking down these binaries of black and white versus color.
Digital versus analog. Yeah, I mean, the binaries in photography, I think, and this goes back to the categories. I think categories, as we know, are always shifting. And in photography, there's the pretense that they're fixed. And I think that's, one of the things that the work is, addressing is the mutability of the categorizations.
With that in mind, the Eastman Museum is a museum of photography and film, or photography and the moving image, I should say. And you studied photography at RISD. You worked for some time printing professionally. You also did art documentation, and then for 25 years at least, you've also been an educator. And in that capacity, you've also moved between photography-specific programs at the graduate and undergraduate level, and also just fine art programs. And similarly, your work has circulated between these contexts where, in some cases, it operates in a very particular way, I think, here at the Eastman Museum. But for instance, the major installation of yours, Tilt Swing 360 Degrees, came up a little bit before this, is in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And that installation was acquired by the museum's Department of Painting and Sculpture. And so I'm curious how you think about the role of medium at this point.
Can we talk about the word medium?
Please.
Like, as a historian, curator, because it's one of those words that, you know, maybe this is like rebellious, but like I'm not even quite sure what that. Everybody uses it, but I'm not quite sure what it even really signifies right now.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's still freighted with so much baggage from a modernist discourse of medium specificity, most of which comes out of discourses of painting and sculpture. And I think that's part of what's interesting about the provocation of Tilt Swing being in MoMA's Department of P&S rather than photo. Maybe to like turn it a little bit then towards a personal, I find myself increasingly drawn to talking about photographic media, in part from my own desire to utilize other sort of approaches of thinking about photographic images that are attendant to those technical histories, and I think that's part of what's so germane about your work in this context. So maybe that is, like, is medium something we want to throw out?
I think, you know, there's two things existing at once. Like, the Tilt Swing came from a drawing that Herbert Bayer did when he was teaching at the Bauhaus, which, if it had ever been actualized, would have been the substrate for painting's presentation. And obviously, you know, didn't come to fruition. So when I made it, I really wanted it to be the substrate, you know, as a photographic object was the thing itself. You know, so that's really the thing that I'm interested in, and you know, what we call these things, be it, you know, photographic, sculptural, architectural. What I'm really interested in, at least with that body of work, is, you know, as I said, like, photography as, not as a metaphor, but as the thing itself. It's not a stand-in for anything else.
It's very concrete in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, it's concrete, but hopefully, you know, referencing what would have happened in the 30s if it had actually been actualized is also part of the work. And nobody needs to know that when they're encountering the work. I think it's something that, you know, I made some changes. Like, Herbert Bayer had a viewing platform, and in the sculptural piece that I made, there's a way of being in the work or outside of the work, and those options weren't available in his drawing. So there's a reference to historical precedents with expansions. So, you know, without referencing expanded photography, you know, that's obviously been a huge interest, is sort of taking what's known and hopefully going beyond through looking at the materials. So if you want to talk about medium, I'd rather talk about, like, the materials that we utilize.
With that in mind, maybe
Yeah.
you could touch a little bit on the two other works that are in the exhibition.
Sure.
For which
Sure.
there is certainly a lot of material specificity, but may be not as obvious to some people, some visitors.
Yeah, I mean, I became really interested in sort of the connection between this and devices that landscape painters used in the 1600s. And, you know, you've got obviously the clawed glass, which landscape painters would bring out. But then I also discovered the colored filters that landscape painters would use. And, you know, we all think of filtration as being a phenomena now, but it's it's really old. So if, a landscape painter wanted to make something more yellow, let's say, Claude Laurent, you've got an amber yellow filter. You don't like the way something is, you can change it. So I was sort of interested in collapsing, what we think of the here and now, and looking at some of his precedences. And of course, the glass that's made for our phones, I thought would be the perfect substrate for looking at how we filter things now. Long story, but I, managed to get our cell phone glass in sizes that it's not made at, and UV printed, on top of it. So it's like so much labor in terms of research and making, down to like the cuts, in the corners, to really look at, how we filter now. And you would think that would be a transparent experience, but it's actually an opaque experience. So part of it intentionally is about sort of like, you've got the side that's not printed on that reflects, and then the side that's printed on that, alters our perception, but not about transparency. Like, it really does become about opacity.
And a really, I think, quite beautiful, remarkable thing happens when light passes from one side to the other. In some cases, if there is some other surface behind it, as is the case in the peristyle, that color becomes projected onto the receiving surface behind it as well.
Yeah, I mean, there was a phenomena that I thought was going to be really complicated to, arrive at what, desired. Like, this is the interesting thing about working with materials. Like, I didn't know how the glass was going to behave. I'd never printed on Gorilla Glass, before, but it ended up behaving in a way that was aspirational. That there's not one square, but there's like a multitude of squares as it, sort of projects, onto the wall. So to go back to your conversation of medium, like if we're to look at materials have histories. They all intersect. Some are used to support different economies. Photography, there's a reason why photography has built-in obsolescence, because it parallels capitalist production to that. So to look at the materials for me is infinitely more desirable, because we don't know what's actually, or I don't know what's going to result. So that's a long way to sort of circumvent your question.
But I think also, we think a lot about, in the staging of exhibitions like Liz's at the museum, we think a lot about how visitors will encounter the work and what types of information is communicated through the didactic materials and the other texts and whatnot. And I think one of the things that hopefully is apparent from how we're talking about this, but if you have had a chance to visit the exhibition in the peristyle, is that there are multiple entry points. And that, as you read the wall label there, one might notice that it is specifically Kodak dyes that are used on Epson paper in the third work that's on display called Study Shelf. One might notice that the Gorilla Glass pieces here, Gorilla Glass is in the title, and then there is a more sort of, I would describe technical, chemical description of what's happening with the glass. And there's a lot of this metadata that's sort of embedded in there that one may or may not access initially, but some of those things might connect and might start to add these conceptual layers to understanding what the materials are that you're working with. But then ultimately also one encounters them as a body in space and moving along the peristyle. And that's a space that is really distinctive in its cathedral-like verticality, but also the lateral prescription of movement that one is sort of compelled through the space down towards the windows at the end. And I think your installation really sort of responds to that spatial condition, that architectural condition. And I think there's that that tension then between this bodily experience that I've just described and then the ways in which these conceptual aspects, these historical referential aspects are embedded in the work, that offers up like new ways of approaching each of those things. So it becomes for me a way of encountering the historicity of visuality. So much of your work is about sort of like stripping away certain layers to get at the grounds that make visibility possible.
That's nice. That's really generous. Mike. It's really generous of you.
Thank you.
Yeah. How do I respond to that? Because I was thinking about like, I can't get over the medium thing because I'm like, and I knew it was going to come up because Phil graciously shared the questions with me, and I'm thinking like, even though I said all the things that I said, of course photography is still primary, right? Like, and that's a duality or the contradiction, you know. And I think not only do people hold contradictions, but I think disciplines do too, right?
And I think so much of the function of medium as a discursive term across certainly 20th century art history was a normative function. It was meant to sort of set up a set of expectations and criteria in a positive sense as well. But that normativity is restrictive as well, right?
Yeah, and that's probably the thing that I'm breaking out on. Like, you know, there's obviously the monochrome, and you know, it's not, it won't be lost on anybody that, you know, I've focused on yellow. And you know, early on in my existence, I printed for many photographers, including I printed the Kodachromes for Moholy-Nagy's foundation. And you know, within photography, we all know this. There's different biases. And this piece actually, you know, displays that. It's one set of negatives printed 4 different ways, and these are 2 different negatives printed, you know, a myriad of ways. You know, so in the installation here, you know, yellow is predominant. So when I printed for more commercial photographers, I won't mention any of their names, there was a desire for things to be really warm, you know, in the idea that within American societies, cultures, you know, consumers, warmth really brought people in. I have a really cool aesthetic as a printer, so I had to sort of override that for a lot of people I printed for. So the idea that yellow could draw people in, Kodak was very aware of these biases, right? So the film, and you know, I'd love to talk to you about this. Like, the film could really, really replicate warm colors incredibly, incredibly well. I wanted to nod to that in the exhibition. I want to draw people in and have a conversation about these things that we might not think about. Like when I used to teach kids how to color print, I'd be like, okay, Agfa can go pastel, Fuji can go really cool, and Kodak can go super warm.
And part of what you're then suggesting about the works in our exhibition here is the convergence of histories and materials that are, in some sense, global, but also quite local.
Yeah.
And so Kodak is, of course, in play, but with Gorilla Glass, Corning is also in the mix.
Local.
Also local. And maybe with that in mind, if you want to touch on the third work that we've only obliquely referenced, Study Shelf, that bookends the installation.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I was talking about the yellow there, and obviously I made, and they don't reproduce well. I mean, none of the work reproduces well, but I made dye transfer prints in the late 90s of 7 colors, would reference the colors of elevation maps. So the idea was through these 7 monochromatic prints, I could reference all potential landscapes. And when I made the prints in 97, and I started making them in 96, Kodak had already discontinued the materials. And the printers who I consider to be at least the best printers in the US were really reluctant to make them because they knew it was going to be really hard. Monochromes are, do you think they'd be really easy? But it's really hard to get even surfaces in photography, particularly when you're dealing with films and matrices and masks. Incredibly, incredibly difficult. So it's a nod to my own, history of making, and it's also a nod to what I think is still one of the preeminent printing procedures in color photography. I mean, if you've seen a well done dye transfer print, I think I made a lot of chromogenic prints, but I'm going to share another artist's take on chromogenic prints. Like they're like Formica. If you're looking at them along the side of dye transfer prints.
So it seems like reproduction is a problem in some sense in your work. I mean, you were just
it's almost painful for me to look at. Even though they're really well done, and this is what I have, it's not a dish on anybody who did the photographic work or it. Every artist says you need to see it in person. You do need to see them in person.
You do, and I think there is something, if we want to return to something of an ethics of embodied perception that the work facilitates, there is that sense that I have that's only in walking through and around the exhibition that it begins to reveal itself. And it's
nice.
Each of the objects have multiple aspects. So something I find when I'm walking alongside the FPS installation, which even a regular visitor to the museum could likely pass that installation 3 times in the course of just going to each of the galleries in the 1989 building. As I'm walking alongside it, I find my focus shifting constantly, like my perceptual focus between the reflected images in the photograms, and then there's sort of edges as well. And sometimes I find the staccato effect enabling a very pleasant blurring that happens as I move across it, whereas other times then I'm compelled to slow down and get closer, and there's this sort of push-pull that's often happening there, and that's just not something I experience looking at thousands of images on my phone, for instance, every day.
Yeah, how we see is not just, it's not just optical, right? Like, obviously if you have 2 working eyes, you're always making up the images in our head. But I think what's maybe discounted, isn't accounted for enough is how our bodies take in space. And I know you asked in the preliminary questions, like, why the vertical? This is to go back to Marais, like the vertical is a stand-in for the body, right? Marais actually put light reflective strips on dark bodies so that you could see the movement photographically. But everything, I hope, everything sort of gets inversed with my work. Yeah, hope.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, I think there's often that sort of formal as well as conceptual inversion that you're working through as a series of strategies. So one of the ways I understand that potentially happening in the FPS work is if we think about the verticality of the film strip, typically as it passes through the projector, you have typically then sort of landscape orientation images that are passing vertically through there. And in some ways you've rotated that formal orientation 90 degrees with the FPS works. It seems like that sort of rotation is something that you've done periodically throughout your career. And here I'm thinking specifically also of the Untitled 2012 that was installed at the Whitney Biennial and is now in their collection. And there the ratios and the scale of that work, I believe, is derived from that of the Marcel Breuer designed building where it was exhibited.
Yeah, I mean, it was supposed to be the last biennial in that building, so I thought, like, oh, look at the building, because the building, you know, as a ziggurat looks like an apparatus. So I thought, like, you know, turn it on its side and use the entire space, you know, of one of the floors that actually had like a window that replicates some of the movements of the cameras, right? Like, you know, large format cameras. So, I mean, those were some of the ideas I had, you know, around, you know, working with that very iconic building, which I think when it was launched in '66, you know, was really hated by its neighbors.
It's a wonderful sculpture.
Yeah, I mean, it's not the only building that I've had the privilege of exhibiting in that, you know, in and of itself, like, looks like it could be a camera. I mean, ICA in Boston, the, you know, Diller Scofield Renfro building also has that same, you know, way of looking at the city. You know, and the Walker Art Center also has that. Yeah.
Right, these ways in which you've sort of managed to play off of the architectural apparatus as a surrogate for the photographic apparatus.
That's nice. I think it goes back to sort of like the photographic thing, right? This is good, because like the photographic thing is not necessarily film, paper, cameras, right? It's sort of like a way of thinking about imaging.
Right, and I think of, I'm sorry to cut,
No,
don't mean to cut you
all.
off,
Not
but
at
I
all.
think, you know,
Not at all.
particularly the photograms,
Yeah.
you know, there are images that pass across them, that we may perceive in them, and their surfaces have marks that could be perceived or understood as images, although those too are not stable. But I think because of how they function in terms of their variable reflectivity, thank you, they also are kind of optical devices unto themselves. So not only are they are not produced by a camera, but they do certain things akin to what a camera or a lens might do.
That's nice.
And I think that, I mean, without saying photography in the expanded field, like that is an expansive or a very different idea of what a photograph does functionally, from one which is about a sort of representational depiction. Both of those things are grounded in the world. There is still a like referential relationship to the world, but it's operating very differently here, I think.
I think that's a really nice way to think. No, I mean it's a nice way to think. It's a nice way to think about it. Like if I were to say that about my work, it would sound, you know, obviously really arrogant or, you know. But I really appreciate you saying it.
Well, I think, you know, I mean, again, to be a little personal, I think that's a part of the responsibility of a curator as a critical historian is to try and find an understanding of, you know, I respond to works like yours and other artists, some of whom are in the room, as problems to be grappled with. Like, I want personally and for our museum to be working with artists who are sort of challenging our ideas of what it is that photographs are and can do. And then it becomes a responsibility to try and find a language for that.
That's
and
nice.
that can start out as something very abstracted, but ultimately it's about then working it out to make it communicable to a broader audience as well.
I think should we open it up?
Yeah, it's a great time to open it up for questions. I don't know if, Emma, do we have a third operating microphone? Or
Does this work? Yes.
Yes.
Cool. So we would welcome any further questions from you.
Liz, could you talk to us a little bit about your interest in measurement? And I think you're quite meticulous in how you're thinking about the materials you're working with, but really I think like your notebooks would probably be quite illuminating in terms of the time and dedication you spend thinking about measuring and other types of calculations and how that kind of factors itself into the work as well.
I'll answer it in a maybe not methodical way, like, because I'm really interested in how we measure time, and this goes back to the material thing. I think when the work's successful, it deals with, time in terms of pre-made materials, like say, for example, if I buy Ilford paper, right, it's dated. Work with it, it changes in ways that I can't necessarily predict. So there's that time, right, the sort of extended time. Photography, even when it's not, camera-based, stamped, is always dealing with, measurements of time. I used to give an assignment when I taught foundations for each student to deal with something to do with time, and I would tell them it was the one assignment I would give them throughout the semester. It was completely unscrew-upable. The only way they could screw it up was by not doing it. Because it's, whether you're dealing with shutter speeds or not, it's always sort of inherent. So measurement and time, two things I'm really, really obviously interested in. Like how we measure time. Like we measure it one way right now, but it wouldn't necessarily be the only way, correct? So this is sort of maybe discursive. Like I actually I did a long project when I was living in Paris of looking at the meridian, because at least in Europe, Paris had the meridian before it was given to the British, and it was all about measurements. Like the British were supposed to adopt the meter, and they never did, in exchange for time. So in a more abstract way, measurements are something I'm really, really interested in. And when I'm trying to work stuff out in spaces, I either make physical models, SketchUps only tell me so much, or I actually try to go to spaces that are stand-ins for like when I did the biennial, I was teaching at Benedict College at the time, and the college's gallery had the same footprint as the third floor of the Whitney Museum. So I spent months trying to, because you go in as an artist in a group show and you have a couple days to install if you're lucky. Well, what if you screw it up, right? Like you don't get another chance to do these things, right? So I spent months figuring out what was like the proper proportion, via a gallery that was trying to replicate like the Whitney. So a lot of my taking things on are really hands-on. A cardboard like we did here at Eastman can tell me almost as much as a photograph can. So my answer to your question is, the precision is about me looking. Like I can do as many drawings as I want, but it's not until it's actually, in the space do I realize whether I made the right or the wrong decisions. And sometimes that's okay, and sometimes it's not. Like big group shows for me, getting things wrong. No, because the stakes are really strange, right? Like there's like all this pressure, but it's like 50 other people feeling the same amount of pressure. Yeah, thanks for the question.
So I'm really interested in this conversation you've been having about how your objects are the thing itself, right? Then we always talk about photographs reproducing the thing itself or becoming the thing itself, or are photographs the thing themselves? And inherently they're reproductions of the world or time or other things. But what I've always really appreciated, hopefully there's a question in this, what I've really appreciated about your work is that it breaks down the components of photography into all these different pieces. So for instance, when you all were talking about, engaging in the spaces of different buildings that you've been in, and them being kind of like cameras. I really think about how every time I've experienced your work, it frames the space, right? And that idea of framing is inherently photography, right? It's inherently a photographic notion. Or the way that I engage with the piece that's hanging, the Gorilla Glass piece in the show, and just watching it change and watching the surface change and the colors change. And that's exactly what I do with every photograph that I see in the main galleries, right? So really, to me, I love the emphasis that your work places on each of those different ideas of what photographs are, how they come about in being. It really is that reduction, but also kind of an explosion, if you will, of all of the components of photography at once, depending upon like what mood I'm in or how I'm engaging with it. So I really appreciate that fact that like as you're walking by it on any given day, you're going to experience it in a different way. And it makes me really like want everybody to come every day like I get to walk by it and see it in a different light, in a different format. And I completely agree with you that not being able to see something isn't the same as seeing it in a reproduction. Yeah. So there, again, there's no question. I'm sorry.
No, it's actually really helpful for me to hear, because the thing I can't factor in, and I talk about this with graduate students all the time, is how people are going to engage with the work. I can set up all the conditions and in collaboration with institutions, but I can't dictate the terms, and I'm not interested in dictating the terms, obviously, evidently. So I'm grateful to hear that, as somebody who comes into the building in a way that probably very few other people will, aside from your colleagues, that it's engaging enough that you continue to engage, right? Like that's completely fulfilling, and in a way that artists don't always know, right? Like that engagement is a big question mark.
I'd love to pull out something that Jamie's remark made me think about, which is in terms of this notion of framing relative to the context of display. What seems striking to me about the operation of that kind of framing is that it's a framing without enclosure. And again, that feels like a very different type of operation. And part of that, I think, is, particularly in something like the FPS work, the way in which my sense of any images that I'm experiencing on it is constantly shifting. Like nothing is stable within that. So the notion that it's creating something with the stability of a picture of a space is completely implausible. Like the picture doesn't operate there in some ways. And I think, as Liz and I have talked for now almost to the day I discovered 3 years about this exhibition, this question of sight, comes up a lot just in terms of the practice of putting together an exhibition, but in your practice more broadly. And, I think sometimes something like site specificity gets floated, and I've suggested at various points that that's not quite right.
Yeah, I don't think it
for
is.
you. I think you work in a way that's site responsive, but that's a different thing in many respects. And one thing we have only glancingly even touched upon in the conversation so far is this relationship to the exhibition in the main galleries and the sort of 75 years of the Eastman Museum and the way in which our collection tells different histories of photography that are on view there. Which you can take that up, or also, want to continue to give opportunities to other people to add to the conversation if you so choose. Greg, can you wait for the mic?
Hi.
Hi, I love the installation, but especially I'm really attracted to the study shelf, and I wanted to ask you about the 3 sizes of, and if you would be willing to share something about that, because I'm it's a mystery to me. But I like the mystery, but I'm also curious to know more if you're willing to share.
Yeah, I hope it's not too simple. Those are some of the standard sizes in photographic papers, when I was learning and teaching photography, so you got 5x7, 8x10, 11x14. It's like, it became really clear to me when I was a student that manufacturing's constraints and my, for lack of a better term, like desires didn't match up. Makes sense, right? Like, just because something's manufactured at a certain side for, as I said earlier, like, economies of all sorts of things, doesn't mean that artistic production should just go by those standard sizes. Yeah, so it's in reference to that, but those are some outmoded things, right? Like if I were teaching color photography right now, I'd be hard pressed to find any of those papers. So it's a little bit historic too.
Thank you.
Thanks for asking the question.
If there are no further questions, I'd like to invite everyone to join us in the Peristyle. The exhibition is going to remain open for a while, so there'll be time to view the exhibition. And if you have further questions or things that you'd like to talk about, we'll be out there for a while as well. And I want you to hopefully please also join me in thanking Liz Deschenes for joining us. Oh,
Hold on, I just want to thank everybody for coming. I do, it was like lousy afternoon, like it was hailing out, like I really appreciate everybody who came tonight. And I want to thank, obviously Phil and everybody who worked on the exhibition. A lot of labor that is not necessarily revealed except for its perfection, like really went into installing and the caring of the works that are on view. So I'm super grateful to Eastman Museum for believing in this project. Thank you.
it's been an honor. Thank you all for joining us, and yes, please join us in the Peristyle.